at the highest level, the bus system in London is what I call institutionally unsafe. In other words, there are a lot of good people working in it, but the net outcomes are unsafe outcomes. The system is unsafe. I'll come back to that a little bit. I want to say about Tom. I mean, Tom, those of your listeners who listen to those episodes probably already know this. He truly is an extraordinary human being. And, because he's taken his traumatic experience of being hit by a bus, but he has worked tirelessly to improve, to uncover first of all, the data, but then these systems, and also the efforts of TfL and the current mayor of London to cover up these problems and to maintain a system which, and these are not trivial outcomes. We're talking about something like 80 people that have died during the mayorship of the current mayor of London. And 2023, the worst outcome for deaths and serious injuries on the London buses since 2016, since Boris was mayor. So you have a mayor who came in talking about vision zero people killed by or on or by a bus by 2030, and he said that in 2017. But we're going in the other direction, and people are dying, and families are being, ripped apart. So Tom has been absolutely brilliant on that. What can I say? I think I was put onto the board of TfL. I was recruited. A lot of it was, I'm pretty good with technology. I'm pretty good with transport, and of course, energy and climate. So I was immediately put onto the sustainability. There was a safety sustainability panel of the board, and I think that I was supposed to work on sustainability mostly. I have mostly worked on safety. And it was Tom who really was instrumental in opening my eyes to the problems, which, for the first year, I'm a startup guy, I'm a media guy, I'm an information guy. So, I don't have a deep history in public transport or safety systems, except that, every engineer has some knowledge of safety. But really, just looking at the outcomes and then listening to the way that the executives talked about incidents, the way that they justified and they the way that they just failed to investigate. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I don't know what Tom has said on those episodes, but there are across London 24,000 bus collisions of some sort every year. TfL investigates 0 of them. 0. The really bad ones, the police investigate. The rest is left up to the bus companies, and 0.5% of them, about 150 a year, TfL asks for information from the bus companies, the private bus companies to whom they contract out the services. And so they don't actually investigate in the sense of, let's see all of the messaging, let's see all of the documentation, let's interview everybody involved, let's do a reconstruction. None of that, right? Now, that is, to my mind, that is extraordinary. And you have the system where TfL is giving out these contracts to bus companies, remunerating them around essentially the bus keeping up with the bus in front. The bus drivers are under enormous pressure, to speed. We know that London buses are breaking the speed limit millions of times per year, but that information is not given to the Metropolitan Police. There's no it's not used for enforcement. In some unspecified way, it may be used to design the timetabling or something. We don't know. So this is a system which is just inherently unsafe, and it's having the outcomes you would expect. London is in the bottom third of safety for cities in a benchmarking exercise run by Imperial College. Probably the least safe city for buses anywhere in any of the major cities in Europe. And I would say, any of your listeners, if you're coming to London as a tourist, stay away from the edges of the pavement and be very, very careful in any bus stops or on the streets. Do not assume that this is a safe environment. It really isn't.
So if you were suddenly made Mayor of London or a TfL commissioner, what would be the 3 main things that you would put into action immediately to help deal with some of this?
So first thing I would do is I would get in somebody to head up safety at TfL who has a really good safety system, safety management pedigree. Somebody out of an airline or somebody out of perhaps UPS actually has an incredible program on road safety. And I would put that person in charge and give them whatever they needed. That would be the first thing. I think the second thing I would do is you can't change the contracts with the bus companies quickly, but I would call together the bus companies and I would say, right, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be publishing data at the bus company level on speeding and on incidents. So you'll have this, terrible incidents, terrible things happen. People are killed by buses. The press releases, which come from, generally from TfL and from the mayor, they don't even mention what line the bus is, let alone who runs that bus. I think and there's this theory that the mayor and TfL have many, many, many times promoted, which is that it's best to work on safety in a private forum between the bus companies and TfL. This is utterly, utterly wrong. Safety needs the detergent of sunlight. Safety needs openness, right? And it needs data and it needs openness. So that would be my second thing, would be to tell the bus companies, this is a new world. We're going to be washing our dirty linen, and we're going to lean in, and therefore we're going to communicate with survivors and their families in a completely different way. And I think then the third thing would be to kick off a process of retendering or changing the contract terms to get rid of this absurdness where you are paid on miles and speeding, and we need to rethink that and make those contracts, institutionally safe. We need to build safety in from those contracts up, rather than just sort of abdicating responsibility for what inevitable outcomes of that contracting system.
The recently successfully elected Labour government is proposing a better buses bill. You might have just answered the question I'm going to ask now exactly in the previous question or the previous answer. But given your experience being in charge of TfL's safety panel, what lessons from London do you think should be incorporated into that legislation?
I think it's variants of the answer that I've given. The Better Buses Bill is about rolling out the so-called London model. The London model being a central transport authority that franchises out the delivery of services to private companies. So that's all fine as long as the contract with the private company builds in safety, has the incentives for safety. So the Better Buses Bill has to have that. It has to have data. We need baseline data. How many incidents are there? We don't even know. The only reason we know in London is because of Tom. So why don't we know every single mayor or council that wants to roll out those sorts of services or transfer services to that umbrella? They have to produce a baseline, and then they have to produce the data. And then the other thing is, I think at the national level, it is extraordinary that we have a rail accident investigation board. We have no independent agency investigating public transport crashes other than rail. So we have, and what happens is when you have a rail crash, then multiple people die. So the Sandilands crash, which, by the way, Sandilands, the Croydon tram, was run the exact same way as the buses. It was the same sort of contract structure. 7 people were killed, and there were 4 investigations: police, an internal TfL1, Rail Accident Investigation Bureau branch, and the ORR, so Health and Safety, which, by the way, came up with the biggest fine in history on literally the same organizations that set up and ran the Croydon tram, not just implicated, led the creation of this London model. So they were investigated because it was rail, because it was a tram. There was an investigation. The thing with buses is you tend to get 1, 2, 3 people at a time. You tend to get at most one person at a time dying in a bus crash. You don't tend to get. I'm not talking about coaches on the motorway. I'm talking about within London at a London bus stop, a cyclist, an old person not quick enough crossing the road, those sorts of things. It tends to be the vulnerable road user who dies. So TfL will spout all sorts of statistics about how safe bus transport is, dividing the number of deaths by the number of passengers, but it's not the passengers that are dying generally. Right? The people who are dying are the vulnerable road users or vulnerable bus stop users, and so but it's in ones and it's in ones and twos, generally ones. So it's really important that we look at it and say, well, hang on a second, but over the course of a year in London, it's 8, 10, 12, 14 people. And yet, so it's 2 Sandylands, 2 Croydon Cram Trashers per year, but no investigations. At best, you'll get a police investigation, but they're only interested in blame. They're only interested in if somebody was, if there's a criminal charges to be pressed. They're not interested in learning from each accident in order to prevent similar ones happening in the future. By the time it gets to the inquest, you could be, the inquest was 4 years later for the Sandylands victims. So, we've got a lot of work to do on independent investigations in a timely way and then enforcing the outcomes of those investigations. If you look at the sentencing remarks, Justice Fraser, at the end of that Sandylands process, he talked about complacency about safety. He talked about the Sandylands crash being an accident waiting to happen. He called it literally an accident waiting to happen, but there were no corporate manslaughter charges brought. How can that be? If you're the family and your loved one was killed by a system which was safety complacent and an accident waiting to happen, how can nobody be held to account? And I don't mean the driver. I mean the people who presided over that system. So accountability we need. And I think the Better Buses Bill could do it. We just need to get those things into that bill, because then there's a framework to push it out across the country.
So we're recording this in September 2024, and last week, Rail Minister Peter Hendy made the news because there was some evidence that he hounded a contract engineer out of his job because he spoke up about safety concerns. And obviously, you've just been talking about safety concerns at Euston Station. You served with him when he was commissioner. Do you think the minister is capable of that kind of behaviour? Is that, is it possible that could have happened?
Well, we know it happened. We know it happened because we've seen the emails and we've seen the letter. So the minister wrote a letter. Ultimately, there was a number of internal emails that have surfaced, and then he wrote a letter to a contractor, Sistra, essentially saying, that this employee, if he is not disciplined, and I don't know the exact wording in the letter, but you might want to link to it if you think it's of interest, saying that contractor will not get any, it will impact their ability to win work from National Rail, which is a big deal if you're a contractor in the rail industry. But he also mentioned all the supply chain. So, I mean, this is evidence. This is not a suggestion, or this is evidence of a vendetta, and it's real evidence. Is it of a pattern? I've never seen anything like that. There was actually, going back to Sandylands, there was an engineer, somebody called Snowden, who worked on the tram in 2008 before it belonged to Transport for London, and raised concerns about that very Sandylands corner where there was later a crash. And when TfL bought Tramtrack London, the operator, Snowden was no longer employed. We don't know why. No idea why, whether he was let go with an NDA, with a non-disclosure agreement, or whether he just decided to do other things. Don't know. But there are other examples of engineers, therefore, raising the alarm about safety issues and not being taken seriously within the transport industry as a whole. And I think, look, the Germans have a fantastic saying, der Fisch stinkt vom Kopf. Right? The rotting fish smells from its head. And that's not a point about that particular rail minister, Hendy, although he has been a senior figure across Transport for London, National Rail, and the Transport Industry First Group, and so on. But, when I say that the bus system is institutionally unsafe, that's what I mean. I mean that the senior people are creating systems where even good people working lower down in the organization, good bus drivers, good controllers at bus companies, they can't escape the pressures that they're under. They don't have the ability to change those pressures. Only the senior people and then the political, structures have the ability to change that institutional lack of safety. And I do think, I'm afraid, it may be better in rail because there were some major accidents, and then there was the Cullen Review, which really lifted the drains and found all sorts of cultural and systemic problems. So I think the rail industry actually is better, but across the rest of the transport sector, I think it's a huge, huge problem. The lack of modern safety sensibility of the senior people. I work with people in engineering, in other parts of transport like the aviation industry, across the energy industry, and nowhere do I see the attitudes that I see in the bus industry and Transport for London, which are straight out of the 1980s. Nowhere do I see that.